"You are nothing but a gold digger," she said loudly to me. At a dinner table in Seoul, a woman stood up, pointed across the table, and said 7 words that silenced every person in that room. "You are nothing but a gold digger." The woman those words were aimed at didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, didn't even look away. She picked up her napkin, folded it slowly, placed it beside her plate, and smiled. Not out of weakness, not out of shock. She smiled because she already knew something that no one else at that table did. And she had known it for a long time. There was a man sitting 2 seats down from her. Quiet, gray-suited. A family accountant who had served the Park family for over 20 years. He had a folder on his desk at home. He had looked at those numbers hundreds of times. And every single time, he had honored her request to say nothing. That night, he decided he was done honoring it. By the time that dinner ended, everything that woman had been quietly carrying, and everything this family had chosen not to see, would be in the open. But to understand what happened in that room, you need to understand who she was, where she came from, and exactly what she had been carrying in silence. For 3 years. Alone. She met James Park at a corporate finance seminar in Chicago. He was presenting on behalf of his family's import business. She was in the audience taking notes. He made an error in his 3rd slide, a small one, a rounding miscalculation, and she was the only person in the room who caught it. She didn't embarrass him. She waited until the session ended, walked up quietly, and pointed it out. He looked at her for a long moment and said, "How did you catch that?" She said, "It's what I do." They had coffee that evening. Then dinner the following night. Then phone calls that stretched past midnight for weeks after that. It was 2 people who recognized something steady in each other and chose to stay close to it. James was Korean American, raised between Seoul and Los Angeles, the eldest son of a family that carried enormous weight in the form of tradition, expectation, and appearances. He was warm in private, careful in public, and he loved Nadine in a way that was real. She was certain of that. What she was less certain of from the very beginning was his family. Nadine Carter grew up in Baltimore. Not the version of Baltimore people romanticize. The real one. The one where the heat in winter was never guaranteed, where her mother worked double shifts at a care home and still came up short at the end of the month. So she built it herself. She studied harder than anyone in her building had a reason to believe was possible. She got a partial scholarship to a state university, covered the rest with work study and weekend jobs, and graduated with a degree in finance that she had genuinely earned. By her mid-30s, Nadine was a financial consultant with a reputation for being precise, calm, and exceptionally good at finding problems that other people had missed. By that point, she was operating at a level most of her clients didn't fully see. She managed high-value portfolios, held equity in deals she had helped structure, and had built reserves that gave her financial flexibility most people never reach. She had one close friend, a woman named Dana, who had known her since university and who asked very little of her except honesty, which Nadine had always been able to give. She had a small apartment she was proud of, a client list she had built from nothing, and one conviction she never once questioned. Money is not glamour. Money is responsibility. That is who Nadine was before James. The Park family home in Los Angeles was large, immaculately kept, the kind of house that communicated status the moment you stepped through the gate. Designer furniture, framed accolades on walls, a dinner table that seated 14, and was never less than perfectly set. From the outside, the Parks were a portrait of success. Nadine noticed early on that it was only from the outside. There were small things. Comments James made without realizing their weight. A business deal that fell through and was never spoken of again. A tension around money that comfortable people rarely carry. She noticed. She said nothing. The first time Nadine met Mrs. Eleanor Park, she had spent 2 days preparing. She had cooked. Not to impress, because that is not who Nadine was, but because in her family food was how you told people they were welcome. She brought a dish her mother used to make. Something warm. Something that took effort. She walked into that house carrying it with both hands. Mrs. Park looked at it briefly. Then looked at Nadine. Then turned to greet the woman standing behind her, a Korean family friend. With both arms open, a flood of warmth, compliments about her dress, questions about her children. Nadine stood in the entryway holding her dish. A moment passed. Then she walked quietly to the kitchen, set it on the counter, and joined the room as though nothing had happened. Later that evening, she watched Mrs. Park work the gathering with the ease of someone entirely in control of her environment. Gracious to some, invisible walls for others. And for Nadine, a politeness so precisely measured it left no room for anything real. Nadine smiled through all of it. James proposed to Nadine on a Tuesday evening. No grand gesture. No audience. He cooked dinner at his apartment, badly, by his own admission, and somewhere between the burned rice and the smoke alarm going off, he got down on one knee in his kitchen and asked her to marry him. She said yes before he finished the sentence. What followed should have been one of the happiest seasons of her life. It was not. Wedding planning in the Park family was not a conversation. It was a declaration. Mrs. Park had a vision. She had vendors she trusted, a guest list she had mentally assembled for years, a color palette, a venue, a timeline. What she did not have, what she made abundantly clear she did not require, was Nadine's input. Nadine was invited to meetings she was never truly included in. She would sit at the table while Mrs. Park spoke directly to florists, caterers, and coordinators as though the bride were a logistical detail rather than a person. When relatives called to congratulate the family, Mrs. Park referred to Nadine as James's friend. Not once, not twice, but consistently enough that it became impossible to treat as an accident. Nadine raised it with James once. Gently. She chose her words carefully. He started to say something to his mother that evening. She saw him begin to form the words. Then Mrs. Park turned to him with a particular look she had given him his entire life, and the words didn't come. He told Nadine later that his mother was traditional, that she meant no harm, that this was simply how she operated. Nadine looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, and she let it go, because she loved him, and because she had learned a long time ago that not every battle announces itself as the one worth fighting. Then came the conversation James never told her about. 3 months before the wedding, Mrs. Park sat her son down. What she said to him in that room, Nadine would only learn much later. But the effect of it was immediate and unmistakable. Mrs. Park told James that Nadine was not what she appeared to be. That a woman who came from so little, who had built her career around other people's money, who had attached herself to a man from a family with a name and a business and a reputation. That woman was not acting out of love. She sees our family name, Mrs. Park told him. She sees the lifestyle. She wants security, James. That is not the same as loving you. James Park was not a cruel man. He was not heartless. But he was a son who had spent his entire life trying to hold the approval of a woman who gave it conditionally. And that conversation planted something in him that he could not quite pull out. The questions started slowly. Small ones at first. Casual. Almost easy to miss. Do you have much saved up? Over breakfast one morning. What happens to your clients if the business slows down? On a drive home from dinner. Do you ever think about what our finances would look like combined? In a tone that was trying very hard to sound like curiosity. Nadine heard every single one of them. She reads subtext the way other people read plain text. She knew exactly where those questions were coming from. She knew the shape of the doubt behind them. And it cut her. Not because she was ashamed of her answers, but because the man who was supposed to know her better than anyone was beginning to look at her through someone else's eyes. She answered every question honestly, calmly, without making him feel accused. And then she went home and sat in her car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before she could make herself go inside. The dinner happened on a Saturday in October. Extended family had gathered at the Park house. Cousins, aunts, a family friend who had known Mrs. Park since university, and Mr. Cho, the family accountant, quiet in his usual chair near the window, watching the room the way he always did. The table was full. The food was generous. And for the first hour, things held together. Then Mrs. Park set down her glass, looked across the table with the kind of composure that takes years to perfect, and said, "You know, I have always believed that the foundation of a good marriage is shared values. Genuine ones." She paused just long enough. Some people marry for love. Others marry for stability. Her eyes did not move from Nadine's face. The table shifted. A cousin laughed, the kind of laugh that fills silence when no one knows what else to do. An aunt looked down at her plate. Someone reached for the water. James said nothing. Nadine held Mrs. Park's gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she placed both hands flat on the table, excused herself with a quiet word about freshening up, and walked to the bathroom at the end of the hallway. She turned the tap on. Cold water. She gripped the edge of the sink and looked at herself in the mirror. And what was happening behind her eyes in that moment was not grief, and it was not rage. It was something steadier and far more difficult to name. The look of a woman absorbing a weight she has carried before. The look of someone who knows that the room she just left has no idea what it is dealing with. She took one breath, then another. Then she whispered 2 words to her own reflection. Not yet. She dried her hands, straightened her dress, walked back down the hallway, and returned to her seat at that table as though nothing had touched her. 2 seats down from where Mrs. Park was sitting, Mr. Cho had stopped eating. He had set down his fork, and he was looking at Nadine with an expression that said he had made a decision. There are people in every family who are never quite seen. Not because they are unimportant, but because they have chosen deliberately and over many years to exist at the edges of things. To watch, to record, to say very little and understand everything. Henry Cho had been the Park family accountant for 23 years. He had advised against the overseas investment that caused the collapse, clearly in writing twice. Mrs. Park had proceeded anyway. He had honored her decision because it was hers to make. He had honored her silence afterward for the same reason. He had sat at their table at Christmas. He had attended the funeral when James's father passed. He had been present at graduations, at business celebrations, at the quiet emergency meetings that happened behind closed doors when things were not going the way the family presented them to the outside world. He knew where every number came from. He knew where every number went. And in 23 years of service to this family, Henry Cho had never once spoken out of turn. He was 64 years old. He wore the same style of gray suit he had worn for 2 decades. He carried a leather folder that had been restitched twice. He did not make small talk. He did not offer opinions unless they were requested. And at family gatherings he occupied the same chair near the window, slightly set back from the main table, close enough to be present, far enough to observe. He had been in that chair the night Mrs. Park said what she said. He had watched it happen. He had heard things said at this table before that he had chosen to absorb in silence. But a family's financial records were one thing. A woman's character was another. He was not willing to sit on both. And something in his expression, something that had been carefully neutral for the better part of 2 decades, shifted. It wasn't the first time he had heard something like that at this table. Just the first time he had decided he would not let it pass. Nadine was in the kitchen when he found her. She was standing at the counter with a glass of water she wasn't drinking, looking at nothing in particular. The sounds of the dinner continued down the hallway, cutlery, conversation, the performance of a family that believed its walls were solid. Mr. Cho entered the kitchen quietly. He did not announce himself. He simply stood beside her for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low enough that it belonged only to the 2 of them. Mrs. Park doesn't know what I know. Nadine turned to look at him. I think it's time she did. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she shook her head. Mr. Cho, please. Not like this. He did not argue with her. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at her with the particular steadiness of a man who has spent a lifetime working with facts and has learned that feelings, however understandable, are not a reason to ignore them. You have protected this family long enough, he said. You do not owe them your silence. He touched the leather folder under his arm, just once briefly, and she understood exactly what was in it. Neither of them spoke after that. He gave a small, deliberate nod. Then he turned and walked back down the hallway toward the dining room, his leather folder under his arm, his footsteps even and unhurried. Nadine stayed where she was. She watched him go. And for the first time since she had walked into that house that evening, something moved across her face that was not composure. Then it was gone. And she straightened, and she went back to the table. And there was one more thing Mr. Cho knew. The restructuring was holding. But barely. One missed payment. One exposed liability. And everything Nadine had built to protect them would begin to collapse. No one in that house understood how close they still were to losing everything. That conversation lasted 40 seconds. What followed it lasted a lifetime. Because what Mr. Cho knew, what he had known for 3 years, what he had watched Nadine carry while the family around her questioned her character, doubted her motives, and reduced her to a caricature of greed, was documented. Precisely. In figures that did not lie and could not be argued with. They drove home from that dinner in silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that has weight to it. The kind where both people are aware that something was said in that room that cannot be unsaid, and neither one of them is sure yet what to do with it. Nadine sat with her hands in her lap and watched the city pass outside her window. James kept his eyes on the road. He opened his mouth twice and closed it again both times. It was only when they were inside his apartment, coats still on, that he finally spoke. And what he said, the precise shape of it, stopped her cold. "I need to know," he said, "that you're not with me because of what my family has." She turned to look at him slowly. Because those were not James's words. Those were his mother's words. Restructured slightly. Delivered in his voice. But unmistakably hers. And that, not the dinner, not the comment at the table, not the months of cold shoulders and careful exclusions, that was what broke something open in Nadine Carter. Not because she was accused. Because the man she had chosen, the man she had loved quietly and consistently and without condition, had sat across from her in their home and looked at her through someone else's eyes. She stood very still. She thought about telling him everything right then. Every number. Every decision. Every night she had worked late solving a problem this family didn't even know it had. Every time she had chosen their stability over her own comfort, without once asking to be thanked for it. She opened her mouth. Then she stopped, because the truth, delivered in anger, in the dark, in a moment soaked in hurt, that was not how this needed to happen. She had not carried this for 3 years to let it come out sideways. So she closed her mouth. And then she said the only thing she was willing to say. "James." Her voice was even, precise. The voice she used when she was working. "Call Mr. Cho. Ask him to come to dinner on Sunday. Ask him to bring the accounts." James stared at her. "What? Why? What is that?" "Just do that." She walked to the bedroom. She pulled a bag from the top of the wardrobe. She folded 3 days of clothing into it with the same careful efficiency she applied to everything. She picked up her phone, her charger, and the book on her nightstand. James stood in the doorway watching her. "Nadine, talk to me. Where are you going?" She zipped the bag. She looked at him. "I love you," she said. "I need you to know that is still true. And I need you to make that call." She walked past him. She picked up her keys from the counter. And she left. She drove to Dana's apartment across the city. Dana asked no questions. She simply opened the door, handed Nadine a cup of tea, and sat with her on the couch in the kind of silence that is the opposite of the silence in that car. The silence of someone who is entirely on your side. Nadine did not cry that night. She sat with the tea going cold in her hands and looked at the middle distance and breathed. Back at the Park house, the phone calls had already started. Mrs. Park had heard from a cousin within the hour. She knew Nadine had left. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and scrolled to Mr. Cho's name. It was nearly 11 o'clock at night. He hesitated. Then he pressed call. It rang once. That was all. Mr. Cho picked up on the first ring. He had been waiting for this call. And when James said haltingly that Nadine had asked him to arrange a dinner, Sunday, the accounts, Mr. Cho present, the old accountant said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "I'll be there. And James, whatever you are feeling right now, I need you to be prepared to feel something very different by the end of Sunday evening." James didn't know what that meant. He would. The following Sunday came the way difficult things always do. Quietly, without announcement, James had set the dining table himself. Formally. The good plates. The kind his mother expected. He had not told her the full reason for the dinner. Only that Mr. Cho had something to go over regarding the family accounts, and that her presence was needed. Mrs. Park arrived at 6 o'clock precisely. She looked around the table, noted Nadine's absence, and allowed herself a small, private arrangement of satisfaction that she did not bother to hide as well as she thought she did. She assumed this was routine. A quarterly review, perhaps. An update on the estate. The kind of meeting she had attended a dozen times, in which Mr. Cho laid out numbers she trusted without examining too closely, and everyone went home reassured. She poured herself a glass of water and waited. Mr. Cho arrived with his leather folder, and took his seat without ceremony. He did not make small talk. He did not accept the offer of food. He placed the folder on the table in front of him, folded his hands over it, and looked at the two people sitting across from him. Then he opened it. "I want to begin," he said, 3 years ago. Mrs. Park shifted almost imperceptibly in her chair. James went still. Mr. Cho did not look up from the documents. He spoke the way he always spoke, measured, factual, without editorializing. As though the numbers were enough on their own, which they were. 3 years ago, he said, the Park family business absorbed a catastrophic loss. A failed overseas investment. One that had been entered into quickly, without sufficient due diligence, in a period when the business was already stretched. The debt that resulted was not manageable through ordinary means. The family was, within months, in a position where the house, the business, and James's sister's continued education were all genuinely at risk. James looked at his mother. Mrs. Park looked at the table. Because James had not known this. Not the full extent of it. He had known there were difficulties. He had not known how close to the edge they had actually come. That information had been held, tightly and deliberately, by one person. His mother. She had chosen to carry it alone rather than allow her family to see the reality beneath the surface. And in doing so, she had also made it impossible for anyone to help her. Anyone, that is, except the one person who had found out anyway. Mr. Cho turned to the second page. Nadine Carter had learned of the debt 18 months into her relationship with James. Not because she had gone looking. A creditor's letter had arrived at the business address. Misdirected, opened by James in her presence, closed again quickly. He said it was nothing. She recognized the letterhead. She knew exactly what kind of nothing it was. She asked Mr. Cho a single question, professionally and in confidence, and he told her enough that she could piece together the rest. She had pieced it together gradually. And when she understood the full picture, she had made a decision. She did not tell James. She got to work. Using her own professional network, contacts she had built over a decade of careful earned work, she quietly restructured the debt. She negotiated with creditors through intermediaries, ensuring no Park name appeared in those conversations in a way that could damage their reputation. She put her professional reputation on the line, her contacts, her credibility, her name attached to negotiations that no one in the Park family knew were happening. The Park family home did not sell. The business did not close. Because of Nadine Carter. Mrs. Park sat very still. Mr. Cho turned to the third page. James's younger sister, Minhee, had begun university 2 years ago. A good school. Expensive. In the aftermath of the debt restructuring, the family's liquid reserves were not sufficient to cover her tuition comfortably. There had been talk of loans, of deferring a year, of options that would have altered the trajectory of a young woman's life. The shortfall had been covered, anonymously, routed through a third-party education fund that left no obvious trace. Mr. Cho looked up. "That was Nadine," he said simply. James made a sound that was not quite a word. He pressed his hand flat against the table. Mrs. Park did not move. Mr. Cho turned to the fourth page. Mrs. Park had handled the loan negotiations herself, as she had handled every financial decision since her husband's death, presenting the outcome to James as settled before he had the chance to be involved in the process. 18 months ago, the Park family business had secured a commercial loan that allowed it to stabilize and begin rebuilding. The family had attributed this to a fortuitous change in the lending climate. To good timing. To the business finally turning a corner. He placed the page on the table and turned it to face them. At the bottom of the loan agreement, in the section requiring a co-signatory to satisfy the lender's risk assessment, a name. Nadine Carter. Her credit history. Her professional standing. Her financial reputation, built over a decade of her own work, placed quietly on the line for a family that did not know she had done it. A family whose matriarch had, at a dinner table 1 week earlier, pointed at her in front of relatives and an accountant and suggested she was only there for what she could take. Mr. Cho closed the folder. He removed his glasses. He set them on top of it, and then he looked directly at Mrs. Park and said the thing he had been holding for 3 years. The woman you called a gold digger has been the financial foundation of this family. She asked me more than once, never to tell you. She was not protecting herself. She was protecting you. He paused. I am telling you anyway. Because what happened at this table last week was wrong. And the truth does not become less true because it is inconvenient. The room held its silence for a long time. James was not looking at his mother. He was looking at the loan document, at the name at the bottom of it, at the signature of a woman who had co-signed for a family that was questioning whether she deserved to be in it. And Mrs. Park, who had walked into that room composed and certain, was not any of those things anymore. Her face did not collapse dramatically. It was quieter than that, and because of that, somehow harder to watch. It was the particular undoing of a person who has just understood, in full, what they got wrong. She looked at the folder. She looked at her son. She looked at the empty chair where Nadine was not sitting. And she said nothing, because there was nothing that fit. No one moved for a long time after Mr. Cho finished speaking. He did not fill the silence. He had said what he came to say. He gathered his folder, replaced his glasses, and excused himself with the same quiet dignity he had carried into that room. The front door closed behind him with barely a sound. And then it was just the two of them, mother and son, at a table that suddenly felt very different from the one they had sat at all their lives. Mrs. Eleanor Park was a woman who had spent 30 years managing fear. At that table, she was not confronting a stranger's cruelty. She was confronting her own. James left the house without saying much. There was nothing that would have been adequate, and he knew it. He sat in his car outside his mother's house and called Nadine. Across the city, at Dana's apartment, Nadine's phone had already rung once that evening. Mr. Cho, brief and factual, telling her only that it was done. She had sat with that for a long time before she could move. It rang through to voicemail. He did not leave a message. There was nothing he could compress into a message that deserved to be compressed. He drove across the city to Dana's building. He found a parking space on the street outside. He turned the engine off. And he waited. He did not call again. He did not text. He simply sat there in the dark, in the stillness of a man who understands that he has run out of moves, and that waiting is now the only honest thing left to offer. 40 minutes passed. Then the building door opened. Nadine stepped out onto the pavement. She had seen his car from the window. She stood for a moment, looking at him through the glass. Then she walked over slowly and stopped on the curb. He got out of the car. He did not reach for her. He did not begin with an explanation or a defense or a cataloging of his mother's faults designed to redirect the weight of what had happened. He had done enough of that already, in the silence of his own car, and he knew none of it held. He looked at her, and he said the only true thing he had. I don't deserve for you to stay. I know that. But I needed you to know that I know. Nadine looked at him for a long moment. The street was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes everything feel more exposed than it should. Then she said, I didn't do it for credit, James. I did it because I loved your family. I wanted them to have the chance to love me back. Just the truth, standing on a pavement at night, being finally heard by the person who should have been listening all along. Some things are not meant to be witnessed. On a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks later, Nadine's phone rang. The name on the screen was Mrs. Eleanor Park. She let it ring 3 times. Then she answered. Mrs. Park spoke for a long time. Nadine listened. The call did not end in silence. It did not end in anger. 3 days later, a handwritten letter arrived at Nadine's apartment. It said very little, but it was in Mrs. Park's handwriting, and it had been sent. She and James did not return to where they had been. What they did instead was harder and more worthwhile. It took time. It asked a great deal of both of them. But they were willing. And sometimes that is enough to begin. Nadine never needed anyone to call her powerful. She was already holding the roof up while they debated whether she deserved to come inside. Sometimes the person the table doubts is the one who built the table. If this story reached something in you, if it brought someone to mind, someone who has been underestimated, overlooked, reduced to an assumption that had nothing to do with who they actually were, share it with them. Not as a gesture, as a reminder that the truth has a way of surfacing, that silence is not always surrender, and that the people who carry the most are rarely the ones making the most noise about it. We bring you stories like this every week. Stories about dignity, about the long patience of people who refuse to let the wrong voices be the final word. If that is something you want more of, you know what to do.